Okay, I guess we'll start now. So welcome everyone to the 110th edition of Databites here at Data and Society. How many of you are here for the first time? Oh wow, pretty good. How many of you have been here many times before? How many of you work here? All right, great. So if you haven't been here before, Databites is our monthly speaker series. We host these talks to highlight some of the research coming out in the space that we are involved in this work, but we also want to engage our network and the broader public with some of these unresolved questions and timely topics. My name is Audrey Evans. I am the Interim Director of Programs and Network Engagement here at Data and Society. For those of you who don't know, Data and Society is an independent research institute focused on the social and cultural issues arising from data-centric and automated technological development. Our major research initiatives include projects studying a diverse range of issues such as future of labor and the on-demand economy, AI, algorithms and accountability, media manipulation, and data privacy. So I want you to stay in touch with us if this is your first time here. You can join our mailing list by going to www.datasociety.net. Shout out to our Director of Communications here for all of this. You can also join us, follow us on social media at Data Society, and the hashtag for today's event is #Databites. And you can also talk to me after this event, and we can talk about different ways for you to stay engaged. A few items of housekeeping. The bathrooms are in the back. Take 2 lefts. There will be a Q&A after the talks where you will have the opportunity to ask a question. Note that we are live streaming, so if you want to be off the record, just let us know and we can make that happen for you. You are here on a really special day here today. We're hosting the first in a series of 3 fellows talks. Over the course of June, we're going to be showcasing all 8 of our amazing fellows, starting tonight, next Wednesday, the 20th, and culminating in the finale on the 27th. I hope you can all be here. We're going to hear from our fellows about some of the important work that they've been doing here at Data and Society. Before I introduce the fellows, I just wanted to say a little bit about the fellowship program and why it's so important to us here. So Data and Society's mission is to work towards a future in which the values that shape technology are visible and intentionally chosen. We do that through conducting interdisciplinary research with our amazing team of researchers, who I hope you can talk to after the talks. But we also do that through building a field of actors that ensures that knowledge guides the development and governance of technology. So a core part of that commitment to expanding the field is our annual fellowship program. When we have the fellows here, it ensures that new connections and perspectives can deepen and expand our community's understanding of these challenges and opportunities that society is facing. Over the past few years, the fellows have done so many amazing things. They have pursued academic research, written code, created artworks, brought together many different communities of activists, and run workshops. They've worked closely with our in-house research team, and they have brought incredible amount of new ideas and perspectives to us. They have really challenged us and deepened the conversation that we're having here at Data and Society. So with that, I'm now excited to introduce to you the speakers of tonight. From our fellowship class. So if you want, again, if you want to hear from, you're going to hear from 3 tonight, but if you want to hear from the other ones who are not speaking tonight, come back over the next 2 Wednesdays. Looking at you, Mari. So up first, I'm going to introduce Claudia Haupt. In addition to being a fellow this year at Data and Society, she is also a resident fellow with the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. She previously taught at Columbia Law School and George Washington University Law School. And we are very excited and proud, can I announce this, to announce that next year she'll be joining the Northwestern University School of Law as an associate professor of law and political science. Congratulations. Claudia's research is situated at the intersection of the First Amendment, health law, and torts in the context of professional speech. You can redefine that if you want when you get up here. And she's going to be speaking to you today about online speech regulation. Take it away, Claudia.
Oh, you turn yours off and I turn mine on. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'm super excited to be here. I remember sitting somewhere over there last year. This is going to be amazing, and it was even better than I thought it would be. All right. So, how do I do this? Right, so I want to talk to you today about a couple of ideas I've been kicking around about online speech regulation. And I think that we've kind of been thinking about similar issues around here. So I hope to throw out just some provocations and prompt a bit of a discussion. So let me first kind of tee up where I'm coming from on this. So as Audrey said, I'm a legal academic. I'm going to be joining Northeastern, so different part of the country, but I'm equally excited. So I'm a legal academic. I work on First Amendment issues, but I'm also a comparativist, and I'm trained in German and U.S. law. So my lens is kind of a comparative free speech law perspective. And so looking at, online speech regulation has been interesting and challenging. So it's become a key concern for lawmakers in several countries. And you might have noticed that regulatory efforts are being met with significant criticism, in particular in transatlantic perspective. And I suggest that there's a real danger here, and that is that those who criticize the European approach to online speech regulation sometimes, I'm not saying all of them, but sometimes merely fall into this trap of trying to relitigate old debates over the permissibility and extent of regulating speech. And that's right, and that's not a critique of online speech regulation. It's just the extension of a discussion that's been waged in the comparative literature for decades. And so here's my provocation. So I would argue that the normative balance between speech protection and speech regulation as a constitutional matter has been struck in different ways around the world, both on the national and on the supranational levels. And this fundamental balance is unlikely to be upset by new speech mediums. All right, I see you are all outraged at this point. Okay, so what does that mean? So let me take a concrete example. So there's a new German law, it's called the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz. That's the short title. And we call it NetzDG, okay? So that law aims to better enforce the country's existing hate speech prohibitions and other criminal code prohibitions on social media platforms. Okay, so it takes an existing legal regime and it tries to implement it online. And so what's, predictably perhaps, one of the main critiques of the law, it's Germany censors speech. All right, so let me just take a step back, pause for a second, and point out that I think that censorship is a super unhelpful term in this context. All right, so like Jack Balkin, for example, I prefer the term speech regulation over censorship. So Balkin notes that people generally consider censorship to be impermissible, but not all regulation of speech is unjustified, right? And I think that's exactly right, and we regulate speech all the time, right? So fraud, true threats, child pornography, right? You get the idea. So, and in comparative perspective, there's another layer of why censorship isn't a analytically helpful term. So typically, most constitutional regimes outside of the United States protect freedom of expression, subject to certain limitations, right? And the constitutional text typically includes a limitations clause. And I'll give you two examples. One is the European Convention on Human Rights, and the other one is from the German Basic Law. All right, so here you have the European Convention on Human Rights, and you see that everyone has the right to freedom of expression, but then you see this typical non-US, right, limitations clause in Section 2. So everyone has the right to freedom of expression, blah, blah, blah. But then the exercise of these freedoms may be subject to restrictions as prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society. And what that means, of course, is subject to interpretation by the European Court of Human Rights, and there's a rich case law on that. The point is that it's very clear that there are limits on free speech. So here's the same thing in the German Basic Law. Everyone has the right to freely express whatever they want, and in fact, there's no censorship. But then you see the limitations clause again in Section 2. So these rights find their limits in the general laws, and so on and so forth. This is completely unremarkable as far as constitutional drafting around the world goes. In fact, this is what most constitutional provisions of that sort look like. All right, so back to NetzDG. So remember, the idea was that the law's goal is to replicate existing criminal code provisions online. That's what the law tries to do. It does that in a really annoying way if you look at the statute, because it just lists all of the provisions of the criminal code without explaining what they are. So I tried to be nice and made a list for you. So that's a list of all the crimes that are addressed in NetzDG. But as you notice, I said these are existing enumerated provisions out of the criminal code, right? So these things are already illegal if you do them offline. This thing just says, whatever you can't do offline, please don't do that online. Okay, not please, but it's, you know. Okay, so you can't do this stuff offline, don't do it online. So one very common criticism of this law, which is of NetzDG, is that Germany prohibits hate speech and the US doesn't. Well, that's true. But that's also really, really, really old news. And I suggest that drawing out the old debate over whether to regulate speech in the first place is really unhelpful in trying to design or assess new regulatory regimes for online speech, and it actually obscures deeper theoretical concerns that are raised by the nature of online speech. So where does that leave us? So we have different sets of free speech values, and those free speech values will be expected by supranational and national governments and their citizens to be equally applied online and offline. That's the whole idea I was just talking about. All right, so national or supranational legal systems that have struck the balance in favor of hate speech regulation, for example, will try to seek such regulation to be mirrored online as well. That's the NetzDG example. I'm not trying to say it does so successfully or even constitutionally from a German perspective, right? So the point isn't this is great. The point is just this is not at all surprising. So you have a set of rules that governs life elsewhere. You can kind of expect that that set of rules would be applicable in the online space as well. So any emergent theory of online speech regulation must acknowledge that, for better or worse, it will not likely be the American understanding of free speech, which is an outlier in its protection of hate speech and other forms of expression that are impermissible elsewhere. It's unlikely to be that understanding of free speech that will govern online around the world. And the challenge lies in identifying whether or to what extent online speech regulation is different from offline speech regulation, right? So I said, you know, all we're trying to do is take the offline stuff and put it online. Well, maybe that doesn't work because of some features of online speech. Once we figured that out, we need to figure out how new regulatory regimes should account for that difference. But that first requires understanding the national and supranational frameworks of speech protections and their respective limits in which regulation of online speech occurs before we can assess the extent to which regulation might be compatible across systems. Okay. So you might have noticed that the US has a peculiar way of treating free speech. The First Amendment is usually wielded as kind of a all-purpose weapon when people want to say whatever it is they want to say, right? No matter what it is, stupid or racist or you name it. And it seems to me that the dominant theory of free speech in the online speech discussion is the marketplace theory, which is one of a couple of standard free speech theories in the US. So we generally attribute this to Justice Holmes, who said that the best test for truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, right? So what could possibly go wrong in trying to find truth in that way online? There's also a strong notion of First Amendment absolutism in the US, which basically means once it's protected as speech, that's the end of the story. Now combine that with internet utopianism or idealism, and you can see exactly how we ended up where we are. You also may have noticed that the rest of the world doesn't do it that way, or if you haven't noticed, I guess I just told you. So US free speech exceptionalism is a pretty noticeable phenomenon in the real world. And Europe and Germany in particular has a very different attitude towards free speech and especially hate speech. And I guess you could oversimplify and say that that's because they've experienced the downside most immediately. But that's not really the full story, because there are different First Amendment traditions in the US as well. They just get glossed over in the discussion of online speech regulation. So there are First Amendment theories that are built on autonomy, speaker autonomy for the most part. And then there are theories of democratic self-government that are alternatives to this marketplace conception. And they may actually be more useful when we think about the questions raised by online speech. So despite the fact that the marketplace theory and First Amendment absolutism seem to dominate in the tech literature and the online speech literature in the US, we should be a little more careful in trying to decide whether we want to adopt that paradigm or perhaps we should reconsider. So what do I suggest we do now? I know that what I have to do now is, which is wrap up soon, but so what should we do now? So we start from the premise of largely settled arrangements regarding the scope and limits of constitutional speech protection that differ among nations. So I think it's the first step to just start with that premise. Different things exist in the world. Then we try to understand regulatory efforts elsewhere within their constitutional context, and I would argue also their historical context. Just be aware of the historical forces that have influenced this constitutional balance. So then we can assess the new legislation in its own constitutional framework. So for NetzDG, that means it may be running up against domestic constitutional law in Germany, but the point is not that hate speech regulation is impermissible. The point is that it may not fit with interpretations of the existing free speech regime. And there's a large body of court decisions interpreting the constitutional provisions and the extent to which criminal provisions can limit speech. So in other words, this has nothing to do with the First Amendment, right? This is a purely German domestic law question. So then the next step is that this deep skepticism toward European regulatory efforts may be misguided because it obscures what the extent to which regulation might be possible in the US. And so that's the important point we get to when we get to talk about the transnational or the global level, because then we have to figure out what is actually permissible as a regulatory effort elsewhere. But we should only be doing that after we understand the regulatory framework at its point of origin. And so I guess the takeaway is we need much deeper engagement, really, with the range of free speech theories that already exist in the United States, and we need much deeper engagement with the comparative literature on freedom of expression before we can meaningfully assess challenges of online speech regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Next up, let's get my bio out here. You can come on up. Next, we're going to have Rishab Nithyanand. Rishab was our Ford Mozilla Open Web Fellow this year. The Open Web Fellowship is a 10-month fellowship program that brings together technology talent and civil society organizations from around the world to advance and protect the open internet. And we were extremely lucky to be able to host Rishab at Data and Society this year and to learn from his approach to understanding and exploring the ever-evolving ecosystems of the internet. Rishab's work is geared towards defending anonymity, understanding internet censorship, and measuring aspects of the advertising and tracking ecosystem. I know our media manipulation team benefited tremendously from having you here this year, so thank you very much. We are also incredibly excited to announce Rishab has just accepted a position as Assistant Professor of Computer Science at the University of Iowa. Is that the right institution?
That's perfect.
Sorry. Congratulations. Rishab is going to speak to us today about his year of tussling with privacy on the internet. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Doing this fellowship was one of the best things I've done, just being able to work alongside some amazing fellows who are going to be talking today and in the couple of weeks after was phenomenal. And then working with people at Data and Society, it just exposed me to ideas that I would never have had outside. So I'm going to be telling you about some of the work that I've done over the past year. Is the mic on? Yeah. All right. Cool. So my area of research and the things that I'm interested are centered around trying to understand tussles that exist on the internet, right? The internet serves many different communities, and often each of these communities has conflicting goals and ideologies. And as the diversity on the internet starts to increase, we start to see these goals and ideologies starting to conflict with each other. And we start to see tussles emerge. And my job as a researcher, or the things I like to do as a researcher, are perform quantitative measurements of the tussles that exist on the internet. And the reason that this is important is because it gives people who are able to facilitate effective public debate and write meaningful regulation or policy around these tussles actual quantitative evidence on which they can base their regulation and debate. But the problem is that getting these numbers is often quite difficult to do. And the reason that it's difficult is because the internet is opaque. Often there are many hidden interests at play, and business relationships between entities on the internet are unknown. The internet is very diverse. There's a range of different networks, a range of different interests at play again. And it's decentralized, which means that getting access to vantage points from which you can conduct measurements is very, very challenging. So getting quantitative evidence of anything on the internet is very hard because you need to deal with all of these things. And funnily enough, it's these three things that make the internet as wonderful as it is today. That's the reason that the internet actually thrives. So just to give you an idea of three tussles that I think have been at the forefront of the internet for the last couple of years. There's a tussle ongoing between privacy and profitability. There's another one that's going on between free speech and civility. And finally, we have something that's quite similar to that, but a little bit different, a tussle between anonymity and accountability. So today, I'm just going to focus on the work I've done over the past year that focuses on the first tussle, right? Every internet user has a right to privacy. And it's really important that we respect that right, because not doing so enables things that aren't so great, and it enables discrimination of users online, and this can translate into real-world discrimination as well. It facilitates the creation of filter bubbles, and it also consolidates systems of oppression and power. But on the other hand, giving all users their privacy right away is quite dangerous because the internet economy is built on user data as its currency. It is the driving force of the internet economy. And so giving users privacy immediately basically means the internet would cease to exist the way it does. And we would have to have content providers and service providers providing services and generating content free of cost. And that's just not fair. So I've been trying to do measurements that can help us move away from such a system. And I'm going to be talking to you about one project that I did today that contributes to that. Everyone in this room probably owns a smartphone and has installed many free apps on that device, right? Well, Joan is an exception. And there's a good reason that these apps are available for free. It's because if you're not paying for the product, it's because you are the product. The thing is, behind each of these apps, there are a large number of tracking organizations which are gathering information not just about how you use the app, but more generally about how you use the device, your device, right? So for example, they're gathering information about who you're calling, who you're texting, what you're doing with your phone, even when the app isn't active, right? And what I wanted to do with my research project was to just try and understand what this ecosystem of trackers look like. So basically, I wanted to track the trackers. I wanted to answer questions such as who they were, what information they were gathering from users, which apps were using which trackers, and what regulatory challenges they presented, right? And to answer this question, in collaboration with researchers at UC Berkeley, Stony Brook University, and several other institutions, we built something called the Lumen Privacy Monitor. What Lumen does is it basically monitors all of the apps that are installed on your device and identifies when any of these apps is sending personally identifiable information from your device to a third party on the internet, right? And thanks to about 15,000 users of the app, and we were able to monitor this behavior in over 40,000 different Android apps. If you are interested in helping us out, you can get the app at haystack.mobi. We take care to aggregate and anonymize all of the information that we use for our research, right? So I want to tell you about some, and the thing is, unless you've actually read the privacy policies of these apps, you aren't aware of actually what information is going from your phone to third parties and how it's being used. And so Haystack allows you as a user to also see this information. Right, so I want to just quickly go over some of the things that we found. Some of these results may not be very surprising. I encourage you to read the whole paper to get at some of the critical information or the challenges that we're going to face from this ecosystem. The first finding was that the mobile tracking ecosystem is basically an oligopoly, right? We identified about 2,400 tracking services on the internet, and when we started analyzing who their parent organizations were and who owned them, we only found that there were 292 parent organizations that owned all of the services that we identified. There were only a handful that we couldn't find parents for. So this entire ecosystem of trackers that's operating on 40,000 different apps had just 292 organizations involved. And we find that there's two organizations, no surprise, Alphabet and Facebook, that dominate this ecosystem. Alphabet was present in Alphabet-owned trackers were present in about 70% of all of the Android apps that we studied, and Facebook-owned trackers were present in over 30% of all of the trackers we studied. So I just want to quickly tell you about what this graph is. So on the y-axis, so this axis right here, we've got the app and service coverage. So that tells you what fraction of apps had a tracker that was owned by one of these 20 organizations on the x-axis, right? So the blue lines tell you what fraction of apps had a tracker from here, and the red line tells you what fraction of trackers in the entire ecosystem they owned, right? So the second finding was that there were only a handful of organizations that were performing tracking only in one ecosystem. So only on the web platform or only in the mobile platform. A majority of the trackers that we identified on the mobile platform already had a presence on the web, which basically tells us that cross-platform tracking is already the norm. In fact, if we look at the 20 biggest mobile tracker owning organizations, we find that 15 of them have a presence both on the mobile platform and the web. And this is a very interesting result, which basically tells us that it doesn't matter where you are or where you're from, your personally identifiable information, or PII, is more often than not going to cross borders. So when we looked at all of our users, we found that 70% of the PII that was gathered from Lumen users, Lumen Privacy Monitor users, 70% of that data ended up going to a country that was different from where they were. So this data is crossing borders all the time. And when we looked specifically at European Union users, we found that 90% of their PII actually ended up in the United States. 90%, and that has it's a little interesting to see how the GDPR might change that. And we found that 4% ended up terminating in China. So about 95% of all of their PII ended up going outside of the EU. And this is what this graph shows. So on the left-hand side, we basically got all of the PII that ended up leaving the European Union. And on the right-hand side, you see where it actually went. And you can see, basically, it doesn't matter where you are in the EU, your data is going to come to the United States, right? So the previous project that I just described, it's complete, it's been published, and I'm going to spend a couple of minutes to tell you about the stuff that's coming up soon. The previous project was very useful in helping us uncover the relationships between apps and trackers, right? So it was able to tell us what trackers were used by which apps in the Android ecosystem, right? And that was thanks to the Lumen Privacy Monitor, and that's the logo. So basically, we were able to draw these relationships right here. What it did not tell us anything about was what happened once these trackers had your data. What was happening to this data? Who was buying this data and for how much? Were there certain types of data that were more expensive or more useful for them to gather? That's basically the project that we're working on right now, and you can expect some work probably in the next couple of months from this project. A second thing that the previous two projects that I just described did not answer were whether the information that's being gathered by these trackers is actually useful, right? Or is it just excessive data gathering? So I want to know how the loss of user privacy due to all of this data that they collect, how that actually impacts the revenue gained by organizations who rely on targeted advertising, right? So put another way, I want to know what PII is a revenue generator for which industries, right? So to answer this question, I am actually looking to collaborate with people in the ad industry. So if you or someone you know is interested in helping us conduct experiments, please get in touch. We've got some experiments already spec'd out. So the end goal of my research is basically to be able to inform exploration into privacy-friendly economies for the internet. Currently, user data is the driving currency, and we need to find ways to replace it without completely destroying industries, right? So the question we need to answer is, what is a user data and PII-free internet economy that can still be profitable for all of the people that rely on these industries? A bigger picture from my research agenda is to just continue understanding these tussles until meaningful regulation is written around them. As for me, as Audrey announced, I will be moving to Iowa in a couple of weeks to start as an assistant professor there. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Data and Society. I really appreciate all you've done. And if anyone's interested in collaborating and helping us out, you can get in touch with me on Twitter or by email. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishab. We have one final speaker tonight. I have Matthew Jones here. He studies and teaches history of science, technology, computing, and philosophy at Columbia University, where he is the James R. Barker Professor of Contemporary Civilization. He's writing a book on computing and state surveillance of communications, and he is working on Data Mining, the Critique of Artificial Reason, 1963 to 2005. Is that still the title? A historical and ethnographic account of big data, its relation to statistics and machine learning, and its growth as a fundamental new form of technical expertise in business and scientific research. You can see why we enjoyed having him here, given that bio. We have really enjoyed and benefited from Matt's historical perspective this year, and I hope you all will as well. So he's going to talk to you today about data science, literacy, and ethics.
Thank you so much, Audrey. So I'm going to start with a bit of illiteracy around data. The statement that was heard a lot when the first known revelation started coming out about 5 years ago, that it's just metadata. And that just is one of the key illiteracies that we need to, as it were, stamp out. So you might say, what is metadata? And if you were to ask this question of some recent court documents, you'd find this, that the government uses the umbrella term metadata to designate the categories of information it proposes to collect. This metadata comprises redacted categories. And it goes on and on and on. We simply don't know what metadata is, other than it's data about data, and it doesn't have constitutional protections under the Fourth Amendment. Now, why this is interesting is that a lot has followed from a set of beliefs that metadata somehow it does not fall under the way the Fourth Amendment has been rendered in understanding telecommunications. So in a couple of key cases, and I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive and then come out of this, we can see how a logic, which is fundamentally premised on a misunderstanding of the way data is used in just the kind of ways that we've just been hearing about from Rishab. So from a secret decision with a redacted name and date, we learn something crucial, that, quote, so long as no individual has a reasonable expectation of privacy and metadata with a space, right, the large number of persons whose communications will be subjected to the surveillance is irrelevant to the issue of whether a Fourth Amendment search or seizure will occur. The court ruled, in other words, that it doesn't matter, in the case of metadata, if you collect the metadata on one person or hundreds of millions. There's no distinction with scale. Scale does not matter when you're looking at metadata. Now you can see where the illiteracy is coming. The court continued in a few years later, put another way, when one individual does not have a Fourth Amendment interest, grouping together a large number of similarly situated individuals cannot result in the Fourth Amendment interest springing into being ex nihilo. Now, there's a lot of things one might say about this, and I'm particularly interested in how it is that the court system, as it were, has been hacked such that metadata does not fall within the Fourth Amendment. And I'm interested in the education of people in the judiciary such that this seems a reasonable set of inferences, that metadata at scale is no different from the metadata on one of us. We know this is not true. My interests are both the history of the law, the history of how this has been used by surveillance organizations, and the way the technological community has moved. Now, to put this incredibly bluntly, a difference in the literacy one might have about sort of classic undergraduate statistics and something which we might call a kind of data science is that in classic undergrad statistics, which probably some of these judicial figures are aware of, you're dealing with aggregation yielding generalizations. And you don't have intense privacy interests. But with the advent of machine learning and computational statistics at scale, massive granular data, as all of you know very well, allows us to know or at least make predictions about individual better. That is, there's a massive privacy interest. And this process leverages quite precisely scale. Now, we could say a lot of things about what the judges did and didn't do, but the point is that they don't understand this fundamental, or they've been made not to understand this fundamental thing about what's different at scale. And this is massively important. It's massively important both as a historical datum about our current legal situation, a legal situation in which the surveillance, the legalities around surveillance in the United States are of crucial import in many other polities, particularly those in the allies of the United States, but beyond that. But it's also crucial in understanding a fundamental ethical project of what is it that we need to do to educate people, to be citizens in a moment in which our technological abilities allow us to think differently when we think at scale. So I'm interested both in that historical project, and when I have my sort of standard academic historical effort, that's primarily what I'm doing. But I'm also interested in precisely what are some of the answers going to be to this vital ethical question of how is it that we train people to think about this differently, and how do we train people who aren't technical experts? How do we communicate about this? And that is why it's been such a privilege to be here at Data and Society, because that is precisely the ambit here. Now, just to go back to the judges, I want to say something about the bad faith in which a lot of these arguments have been made by people in our national security apparatus, because they knew damn well that doing things at scale mattered. From right after the Second World War, the NSA underwent what is called the traffic analytic revolution, and they write about it in their own histories. They describe the modern break, which is the recognition that cryptological attack can reveal information of value even when it is successful only in recovering the externals of intercepted communication. Now, what matters here is that the NSA, 50 years before the rest of us did, had vast amounts of database space and huge analytic tools. Actually, many of them the progenitor of the analytic tools we use today. And they recognized that at scale, that set of things that we would now call metadata are precisely powerful in indicating and learning about all kinds of people, the organization of states, the organization of what they called the order of battle, and generally on identifying people throughout the world. They understood these externals and they hacked them into the law in ways that are crucially important and something that I'm trying to track down. But it was not just the NSA that understood this. In 1984, a privacy activist drew this diagram. I recently put this on Twitter. And the point of the diagram was to say that something very bad had happened in the understanding of privacy around databases. So in the late 60s, there was a moment of panic about the constitution of a centralized national database. And that became legally impossible in the United States. In the wake of that, we got a Privacy Act, which only regulated federal databases and put strict requirements, or semi-strict requirements, on the way you could perform kinds of aggregations across these kinds of databases. Government lawyers got extremely good at justifying these. Now, as a result of this, instead of one giant database to rule us all, instead, we got a vast number of different kinds of databases. And each one of these, we individually agree to give our data for the purpose of that organization, whether it's department stores, debt collectors, credit bureaus, law enforcement, consumer organizations, vehicle registration, or other sorts of things. But lawyers within the government and elsewhere had become skilled at enabling computer scientists to match, as they said in the 80s, or merge this data in powerful ways and leverage scale. We had collectively, and each of us agreed to give our information for a specific purpose, and it was being used for all sorts of other things. This is a situation we're familiar with. People understood this, a select people, and they let it not be resolved. So my work here, and it's been an extraordinary year, has had 3 facets. And when I applied, I was brutally honest. I said, I'm not going to finish a book while I'm working with, because I don't need that. What I want to do is actually be with lots of people who are thinking about these things from a lot of perspectives, because I need to glean wisdom and knowledge from them. And my project has 3 facets, the third which very much emerged in the course of the year. First, the history of what has become known as data sciences, the history of machine learning, computational statistics, the various places that's coming from, its institutional grounds, its international sort of thing. I could give you an entire lecture. Secondly, the connections between the data sciences and spooks, both funding and inspiration. A tradition that goes to Bletchley Park, but far beyond Bletchley Park is crucial. And thirdly, and that's primarily what I'm going to talk about in my remaining time, is what do we do with this? How do we take the collective wisdom of an organization such as Data Society and begin to think about crucial questions of what is it that our citizens of the future need to be empowered with in order to contend with fundamental policy questions, fundamental questions of privacy, fundamental questions of surveillance, fundamental questions of what it is to be flourishing in a situation where data is produced about unresolved. Now, I've done a lot of this work in collaboration with Chris Wiggins, who is the chief data scientist of the New York Times and an instructor along with me at Columbia, and in his case in applied math and applied physics. And we created a new course. And the course, and this is we gave a lecture and someone made this beautiful diagram. It's called Data Past, Present, and Future. Everything about it's online. And the hypothesis of the course is this. It's that there's important material being taught neither to future statisticians nor to future senators. I teach at Columbia, so we have a lot of would-be future senators, right? And that material is both technical and humanistic. And in the course, we explicitly and always pair intellectual changes with political and ethical context. That is, no matter what kind of technical material we're entering, we always want to be asking collectively with the students, how do technological changes rearrange power? And ours is not a doom and gloom narrative, because many of those changes are very productive ones, and many of them are the dumpster fires that so many of us are working on. And we want to know prerequisites. We want code geeks, and we want ethics and legal geeks in the same room, and we want to leverage them. So in the course, we fundamentally say that the dream of sciences of social difference has been central to the development of statistics and the data sciences from late 18th century German to the present. There's long been a dream that there could be a kind of statistical reason that would explain human difference and that could be understood through data collection. And we cannot be surprised that we still see that resurge again and again and again. It is central to the history of the development of statistics and the data sciences. And I won't go through this all, but we run from the late 18th century through the high point of mathematical statistics up through cryptography, intelligence, the AI winter, and our current moment when machine learning has been rebranded as artificial intelligence. The key moment and a huge breakpoint is indeed, as is so often the case in the 20th century, the Second World War. And for us, it is the bringing together of vast computational power to collect data and an intense development of tools precisely to work on it at scale. Most of this exists in the shadows for much of the rest of the 20th century before becoming central to where we are. Our persistent observation is that the dynamic of capabilities implies dynamics of power. It is always political. We jump off the course using favorite readings around here, Dana and Kate's Critical Questions for Big Data, Hannah Wallach's wonderful piece, which is amazing for undergraduates about big data, machine learning, and the social sciences. And then we end with, after going through much of the technical history, with the failures of research ethics, whether the Tuskegee study or the more recent things having to do with Facebook. When we talk about ethics, the class is at once intended to be a solution of a very small part of the question of what is our ethical answer going to be, and an instrument of reflection to make the students recognize the way in which ethics has both a philosophical component, what ought we to do, and an incredibly much harder, challenging institutional one of how is it that we could, in any way, build this into our society at ways that scale. Because those people who would not have ethics are good at scale. We need to be good at scale. We don't have answers for that question of scale, but we want people to have a framework in which to talk about it. So I just want to end by going back to spies, black boxes, and ethics. So at the beginning of the talk, I talked about the way the intelligence community hacked the legal system in a remarkable way, in a very knowing way, in a very underhanded way. But I don't want to end on that for a couple of different reasons. So, in one of the Snowden, if any of you has clearance right now, you need to close your eyes because this is a technically classified document. In a special research report on data mining in JCHQ and NSA, GCHQ being NSA's analog in the UK, they noted this. A problem with the use of random forests, that's one of the key algorithms that underlies a lot of machine learning today, is that their decisions cannot be simply intuitively explained to an analyst. This black box nature can lower analyst trust in a prediction. Someone at NSA has been leading an effort to make random forests more interpretable. All of a sudden, we're in a weird world where the analysts at NSA share many of our deepest concerns about a black box society, about the way in which their traditional forms of understanding the world are being challenged precisely by the algorithms that are most predictively powerful and yet cannot be understood. That is, they are in the position in which their own ethos of intelligence and understanding is being challenged in ways that we see ramifying across many industries, forms of academia, and throughout our society. And it's a problem for them. In a remarkable piece, some unknown person wrote that in the 1980s, the NSA valued accuracy, deep knowledge, thorough expertise. But in the 2000s, it was speed. Getting it right 80% of the time would make all the difference. And then a parenthetical that I find chilling and crucial for so much of our work. Of course, if it were targeting information, that would mean killing innocents 20% of the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to now invite all three of the speakers to come up for a brief Q&A session. So, are there questions from the audience? Here. Hi.
Hi, this is mostly a question for the third speaker. Your name is Matthew, is that right? Okay, I had to look that up. So I'm an ex-political scientist now in industry. So one thing that I have been increasingly concerned about just going through the course of graduate school and comparing it to my undergrad experiences, undergrad teaches you a lot about breadth and not so much about depth. And I think that that's part of the struggle that you have to get past whenever you're trying to figure out, when you're talking about statistics, this is a pretty deep subject. Thinking about causal inference is pretty deep. How do you, I guess the question I've been wondering is like, how do you with undergrads really, when they don't have the background of like really understanding in a sense how facts are made, how they're developed, how do you get across the amount of knowledge that is necessary for them to really be able to take that to things like policy? Like you said, they're going to be senators, right? How, I'm like forming this in my head as I'm talking, how can they create the sort of kind of mental infrastructure to make decisions about things like that without necessarily understanding from a deep level how these facts are created?
Okay, it's absolutely, it's absolutely a huge challenge as in any general science education to be able to answer that question. I think the best we can do is give them examples of different kinds of statistical reasoning and to understand that there are fundamental divides at the very highest level between those, for example, who are interested in causal explanations and those who are not. And to say that those are actually, they're these fundamental divides, and to explore how contingent the constitution of our answers to those. So for example, students can readily, and I'll end quickly because there's a lot, for example, the debate about p-values that is so prominent, particularly in the social scientific community, is one that students can readily understand. They can exemplify, it's very easy to hack p-values, and then understand both why it is that Fisher et al. Decided to introduce this new forms of empiricism, and then its pathologies. Now, are they going to have the kind of graduate statistical education? No. Are they going to be empowered to ask questions about how different fields of expertise define the kind of knowledge they have? I think so. In other words, they're going to be more empowered to be able to leverage people with deep expertise. At least that's the idea. But you're absolutely right. It is a really challenging pedagogical task.
Next question.
I have a question for Claudia. So you mentioned theories of the First Amendment in the U.S., and I was wondering what are the theories of free speech in the EU and mainly in Germany, and whether there's any overlap with the theories of the First Amendment in the United States, so that any dialogue could be possible to view these regulations.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So what strikes me most about that is that in the U.S. we kind of have this trilogy of marketplace theories, autonomy theories, and democratic self-government theories. I think the citizenship kind of theories are much more prevalent in Europe. I think it's hard to generalize across Europe. So the traditions are, the post-war traditions are similar in the sense that in many countries it's a direct reaction against the kind of forces, the constitutional breakdown pre-Second World War. But I think it's harder to generalize there. So in terms of making the kind of values speak to each other, I think we have to first ask, why do we want to protect free speech in the first place? I think reducing it to kind of a theory and then saying, well, this is just like that, and therefore, this is compatible or not, is dangerous, because then you kind of gloss over it. So what I'm trying to do in the next step of this project is actually trying to, for the prescriptive part in this sort of, why do we want to protect speech in the first place, right? What's our goal, and how do we get that implemented in a way that's compatible across systems? And so, right, so the step is identify, without necessarily attaching labels to it, identify the underlying shared interests.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a question for the second speaker, Rishab. So one of the things that you talk about is being able to track how the trackers are tracking us, right? But that sort of suggests that it's only a one-way sort of interaction, but we know it's not. It goes both ways. So they're tracking information about us so they can personalize what we see. But it seems like you have, since you have this sensor on the device, have you thought at all about tracking the other way? So trying to see what those services are providing the user back? Because it's very interesting about how, you know, what I see on my phone is very different than what somebody next to me sees on their phone, based on all the information that I'm giving to all these trackers.
That's a really nice idea. No, we don't do that. It's something that we are looking into. So when I called for help and collaboration, that's actually one of the projects that we're trying to understand. Not just how it affects the type of content that you see, but more of how effective it is in actually generating revenue when you have access to certain types of data. And the idea is to try and understand that there are certain types of data that are just not beneficial for anybody and just results in a loss of privacy. So let's stop collecting that data. So yeah, we don't measure what you're suggesting right now, but it's part of a plan.
Thank you.
And I think we're going to have time for maybe one or two more questions. Did you have a question?
Thank you. This is a question for Matthew. I found it interesting, specifically what you said about the sort of, that you call it an illiteracy with the justice system or the justice individuals. I'm wondering, though, if you would perhaps concede that there is an ideological component to that sense of illiteracy. As a Canadian, it's kind of always shocking to me the slight little ways that the individualist mentality really is embraced in America. And it also strikes me that when people give their information, it's just sort of this sense in which it's like it's my choice and it's an individual choice, and then that sort of ideology would permeate the justice system as well. So instead of seeing it as a sort of conglomerate, it's an ideological sort of paradigm where they're only seeing individuals contributing their metadata.
I mean, that's a wonderful point. Briefly, of course, I agree entirely that the individualist analysis that is built into the way they're examining, particularly Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, it's connected to a whole rich theme of individual liberalism that's very central in the way this part of the law works. There's another part of the law about classification where things about scale are fully understood to make things unclassifiable. But there's I at one point was looking quite precisely at the way these debates were happening in Canada. And one of the really striking things is that in debates in the Canadian Senate, if you were to read only the English, what you find is a lot of participation in precisely this individualistic particular way of thinking, and an aping of a lot of what are largely Anglo-American positions on what espionage should look like. And then you have a bunch of French senators who are like, what are you talking about? Again and again saying, none of this. Like, why does it matter if it's on this side of the border or the other? It is looking into people's stuff. I just don't understand. And that's a little bit of a too blunt point, but it really speaks to sort of very different cultures, both legal cultures and ideological cultures. And it's extremely understudied in the Canadian context, but more broadly at the interface of these different legal regimes.
I want to do a quick moderator's prerogative question. It was so fun to watch all of you work together as fellows this year and think together. I was wondering if you could briefly give a hint of how your work influenced or had resonance with each other in the conversations. I just watched you have all of these amazing aha moments together, and I would love for the audience to hear a little snippet of one of them if you want to share. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Well, since Matt gives me the microphone. So the most tangible benefit I had was when this is, I think, a testament to the generosity of this cohort of fellows. I had just given a job talk, had a job talk paper accepted, and it's one of those law review article, 60 plus pages of boring and no pictures. I knew that I was trying to do something that is perhaps a bad idea, which is to wade into an academic area I knew nothing about. But it just so happened that Matt was here, and without even flinching, he read the entire thing and gave me the most productive feedback I've gotten on a paper in a very long time. So that is just a concrete example of just, the fellows are incredibly generous with their time and their expertise. So everybody become a fellow here.
So thank you very much. Like I said, I'm trying to teach this course. This course is both, I think, necessary and impossible. And I had, every interaction I had, ideas about things we could do. And particularly, a lot of inspiration from Taeyoon and others about pedagogical ways of getting at deep technical points in idioms that you wouldn't expect. And I feel like I haven't leveraged that enough because it's so easy to fall back on traditional. So I got both the sort of surround of the density of concerns that one ought to address, and then an inspiration of ways pedagogically to deal with that, to address precisely the challenge the first questioner had.
For me, I benefit a lot from everybody, but there's two specific things that I think weren't necessarily useful right away, but will be very useful in the next few months. And it's because I don't teach right now, and I will be teaching in a couple of months. And it really has to do, again, with Darakhshan and Taeyoon sitting right there. I've never met people that cared that much about teaching, and specifically in my own discipline of computer science. Darakhshan has just been really inspirational with, just how to be an effective teacher, and also to try and tie it back to social goodness. And Taeyoon does things I never knew were things. And it's just been really inspirational. And some of the projects that I've seen him do at his school have just been phenomenal. And I want to make sure my students have access to people like Taeyoon for a long time. So. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're out of time, but we are about to turn this talk into a reception and hopefully a party where everyone can ask you questions directly. It's been such a pleasure to have you all here this year, and thank you so much for your talks. So a few